All right, session two. Let's keep rolling. The next session is building supply chain resilience for essential commodities. In this hour, we're going to try to reinforce the relationship between supply chain resiliency and emergency management. We're going to try to express and articulate what emergency managers really need to know about supply chains, and we'll provide some actionable strategies for building your supply chain resilience. We've got two panelists today, very qualified on this topic. Mark Scott, Critical Infrastructure Specialist at DC's Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency, and Katie Murphy, Senior Manager of Business Continuity, CNS Wholesalers. So with that, let's get on with it. Mark and Katie, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you very much, and appreciate being invited to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. So again, thanks for having us here this afternoon. As you heard, I'm with the District of Columbia's Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency. I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Katie Murphy from CNS Wholesalers. What we wanted to talk about in this session was an issue that is related to how we get what we're calling essential commodities into our communities. About a little over 4 years ago, my agency started taking a look at this in detail, because what we wanted to understand was how do we get those things into the Washington, D.C. area that we need for our daily life and survival. So we were thinking about all the things that we would call essential commodities. We started out looking at the food sector, and particularly wanted to focus on grocery industry. And based on what we learned on that, we decided to expand our focus. And so we've since looked, in addition to food, at water supply and petroleum fuel and healthcare. And what I'm going to share with you this afternoon are some takeaways and some lessons learned that we've developed from all that work that we've done. And that's certainly not anything we've done in isolation, because we worked alongside a number of our colleagues that are in jurisdictions around the United States that are also thinking about this. So I'm going to be sharing that work with you. When I'm done, I'm going to hand it over to Katie. Katie's going to talk in more detail about her company and how her company and the grocery industry writ large think about resilience, think about dependencies, and think about partnerships. And both of us are really going to be building on some of the themes that you've heard over the last couple of days, particularly related to supply chain and the importance of those kind of partnerships. And when we get done, what we really hope is that you leave with a greater sense of why thinking about supply chain resilience matters to emergency managers. And hopefully maybe taking away a few strategies that you could even employ in your area of responsibility. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. The way we've structured this is that I'll be presenting for the first 20 or so minutes. I'm going to hand it over to Katie after that. When she's done, well, we've left plenty of time at the end to take any questions that you've got. So we'd love to have you drop them into the chat or the Q&A. We'll try to get to all those if we can. If we can't, I know both of us would be happy to talk offline with any of you afterwards about anything we've got. So I'm going to go ahead and start. And I want to start with the question of why we need to worry about this as emergency managers. And the simple answer is that this is a key part of our mission. Our mission is to protect the public health and safety. And we know that one of the ways we need to do that as communities is making sure that people can get access to the things they need for their daily life. And so when we think about supply chains and we think about supply chain resilience, we're really trying to kind of get at these three questions. First is we want to understand what those commodity supply chains look like, and more importantly, how they could get disrupted, because we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. But if it does, we want to be able to, where possible, buy down the risk of that disruption. And
hey, Mark, so you're still on slide one of your.
Are you not seeing?
We can see your screen. Do you want to move into slideshow mode, Mark? This is Laura.
Yeah, let me do that. Apologize for that.
That's okay.
There you go. There you go.
All right, perfect.
Are we good?
You got
All
it.
right. All right. I apologize for that. So this is what we're trying to get done. First off, we want to understand how those supply chains, how those systems could get disrupted. And where possible, we want to be able to look for opportunities to buy down that risk of disruption. And that could be done through, strengthening the emergency plans that we have, or doing different training and exercise. But it also might mean, targeted capital investments like infrastructure improvements, and looking for ways to create supply nodes that are closer to the source of where people demand those commodities. So we want to be able to buy down that risk if possible. But if it is disrupted, we know that as emergency managers, what we would need to do is meet our near-term needs of our residences. And we're really good, and we have a lot of plans to do that. But our ultimate goal is not to do that. Our ultimate goal is to make sure that the flow of those commodities gets restored. And that's where the partnership piece of this really becomes important, because we as government don't own or operate these systems, but we rely on them to bring us what we need in our community. And so that means we need to be working with the people that own and operate these systems and figure out where our mutual roles can be to help restore that flow. So this is where we're trying to get to when we think about this. So as we sort of scan the landscape, we see a lot of the same things that all of you have seen over the last few years. We know that natural disasters are a key source of disrupting these supply chains. We've all seen the projections about climate change impacts and what that might mean. And so we know that this is a big source of a lot of disruption. We know that people can intentionally target these supply chains. All of us saw the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack. JBS, one of the largest meat producers in the United States, got hit with a similar attack during the pandemic. We know that the FBI has said that we can expect additional attacks on supply chains over the next few years. So recognizing that there are folks out there that want to intentionally disrupt these is a source of disruption as well. Of course, we've all been through the last 3 years of a public health emergency that doesn't want to seem to quit. And we know from talking to the scientists that there are concerns about additional viruses that may eventually morph into similar pandemics if they can't be contained. And we know from the pandemic particularly that a lot of what we learned through that was that there were a lot of inefficiencies built into our systems. We've tried to make these supply chains lean. We've outsourced a lot. We've focused on cost optimization. And the pandemic revealed that really is showing a lot of inefficiencies because it leads to a lot of disruption. So paying attention to health emergencies is another one. We know that the infrastructure, particularly the transportation infrastructure that supply chains rely on, it's aging, it's not being kept up, and in some cases it's failing, and it certainly has not been designed for the kind of supply or climate change impacts that we all know we're experiencing now and we can expect in the future. This picture on the lower left is the I-40 bridge over the Mississippi River between Tennessee and Arkansas. And in 21, crack in that bridge, a serious crack was identified. The bridge had to be shut down for emergency inspection and repairs. And this was a major freight route in that part of the country. And it required a rerouting at greater expense and greater time for a lot of that truck traffic, but it also backed up barge traffic on the Mississippi River. So this kind of infrastructure failure really can have some impact on our ability to ship goods. All of us, of course, are following the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We know that conflict has had impacts not just on things like food supply and fuel supply, but also on things like basic metals that are required for semiconductor production and batteries and all sorts of electronic devices that we're more and more reliant on every day. And so it's shown that what happens halfway around the world can really have an effect on what we need and what we have to get in our community. And we're learning too over this last few years about the importance of labor. All of you I know are tracking the truck driver shortage in this country. Seems like it's easing just a little bit, but there is still a projected shortage of truck jobs. And that, of course, is important because much of what's shipped in this country, and particularly where we are, is all comes in by truck. So that has an issue. And we know over the last few weeks that we were facing a potential freight rail strike that could have had seriously damaging effects to a number of supply chains across the country. So our takeaway from this is that there's no shortage of things that could disrupt these, and we need to be paying attention to all these things and seeing how they might affect what we've got. So this is kind of what the landscape has looked like to us as we look to 2023, and we talk to folks in the industry and we say, you know, what does it look like from your subject matter expert perspective? We're seeing a very common theme, which is 2023 is going to be a continued period of volatility in our supply chains. And it's not just the things that we've experienced in the past, but it's things that maybe haven't yet emerged that we need to be thinking about. So the landscape that we're looking at is one of volatility. It's one of multiple sources of disruption. Question that we have as emergency managers has been, so what do we do about that? We can't change these things, but we can change how we respond to them. So what is it that we should be doing? Well, part of the work that we've done has been a lot of introspection about what kind of plans and so forth that we have internally in the Washington, D.C. area that can help deal with this. We've also talked to a number of our colleagues around the country that are in different situations to understand how they're thinking about this. But most importantly, we've been spending a lot of time trying to understand how the business community is thinking about supply chain disruptions and business continuity, because we know that keeping these supply chains flowing is a business imperative. And, you know, we think we can take away a lot of really good insight from watching and seeing how business has done. So thinking about all those inputs, we've identified a whole lot of different strategies for how you could build supply chain resilience, but there's 4 that really sort of stand out to us. And I want to talk about those next and focus a lot on how we've been using those. So the first one, and I think foundational to our understanding of supply chain resilience, is we have to know what these systems look like. We have to know where supplies coming from. We have to know where people are going to get those supplies. And we need to understand what those transportation links are between the two. We can't make decisions about resilience if we don't know what the system looks like, and particularly what's the impact of geographic distance between supply and demand, because we know that that's a key factor in determining how resilient a system is. And that mapping also is going to help us do things like identify areas that are in high hazard areas, or potential choke points in the system that if it goes down, it's going to really stop the flow of the kind of goods we need. So we think that mapping our supply chains is essential, and as mapping it as far as we can, and understanding what the relationships are between the various players in that supply chain is essential. The second thing, and one you've heard over and over for the last couple of days, and I'm going to foot stomp it again, is that we really need to be building partnership relationships. And there's a couple of dimensions to that. One is, as I said earlier, we recognize that supply chains are not owned and operated by government. And so when they get disrupted, we're not the ones that are going to go in and try to fix them. But because we have a vested interest in it, we need to find ways to help facilitate the restoration of that flow. And that means having good relationships with our partners in blue sky days, where we're talking to each other and finding out what each other needs and finding out where those opportunities are to collaborate, where we can add value to each other. The other relationship I'll suggest is between jurisdictions. One of the things that we've learned in the supply chain work that we've done is that we share a lot of our supply chains with folks outside the national capital region. You know, we share a lot with Baltimore and with Philadelphia and with New Jersey and even some places in New York. And so when we're thinking about how we can better prepare for a supply chain disruption, that means we need to be talking to those other jurisdictions, areas where we don't have direct influence, but where we can figure out how we can coordinate on emergency planning and response and so forth. So those relationships are critical. The third strategy is what I'm calling conducting stress tests. We in the emergency management community are really good about doing drills and exercises. We've done them for years. It's an important part of our toolkit. What we need to be doing a greater job at, though, is conducting those stress tests around specific supply chain disruption scenarios and doing those exercises and drills in conjunction with our private sector partners that own and operate those systems. That's the only way we're really going to figure out where the gaps are, where we need to be making improvements, and where both of us need to be working together. So conducting those stress tests is something that I know business does on their own. Government does it pretty well. We need to be doing it more together. And I think focusing more on supply chain disruption scenarios. The last strategy is one that I'm going to call creating early warning systems. We know that a supply chain sometimes gets disrupted with little or no notice. And we've seen plenty of examples of that. We also know that they can be disrupted by events that slowly develop over time. And so to the extent we can, we're looking for ways in which we can identify early on some of those warning signs where something is going to happen that might make it difficult for us to get essential commodities into our community. And that means we can build off of the really good early warning system that the National Weather Service has for natural disasters, but apply that across the board to our supply chains and start looking for warning signs that maybe we wouldn't have looked at before. So I'm going to wrap up my portion of this presentation by giving you a few examples of how we've tried to apply these 4 strategies in the Washington, D.C. area. And I hope this is going to give you some sense of how we think these strategies can be used. And by no means these are not perfect, but there are ways in which I think we can understand how better to build resilience into our systems. And I'm going to start with the food supply chain, and particularly the groceries. We wanted to know where people get food in the National Capital Region on a day-to-day basis. And we know that people get food from a lot of places, but we also know that one of the major sources is going to grocery stores. And so we took the top 10 grocery brands in the National Capital Region. We identified where their stores were in the region. With a little detective work, then we figured out where their distribution centers were that served those stores. We overlaid on top of that the freight network that serves our region. And so now we can start to get a sense of how commodities, particularly groceries, flow from distribution center into our community. We took the additional step of trying to give some relative importance to that. So we were able to identify the relative size of these distribution centers by the number of docks they had, which gives us a sense of the flow that's coming out of those. And we also were able to get some annual revenue data for the grocery brands in our region. And so we were able to do some back calculation and figure out which routes those commodities were coming in on, which routes were the most important. And so what this picture gave us was, first off, we understand a little bit better now what that grocery supply chain looks like. We know who the partners are that we need to work with, and we've begun working with them both on the supplier side and on the demand side and on the transportation side. We can tell where there are potential choke points in this system. We know, for example, that we're heavily reliant on food distribution centers in Eastern Pennsylvania. So we need to know that. We are planning in the coming year to be able to do a series of training and exercises with our grocery sector partners to be able to test out what would happen if there was a major disruption of these. And we're going to be doing that in conjunction with our colleagues in Baltimore and Philadelphia too. So we'll be able to work cross regions in doing that. And in terms of early warning, one of the ways that we were able to use this is back in January of 22, there was a major snowstorm that went through Pennsylvania and in the early part of the month, and it affected the roadways enough that the Commonwealth had to shut down some of those roads for 24 hours to commercial traffic. And what that meant was those distribution centers up there couldn't ship product into the DC area. And we saw a direct impact on that with grocery shelves that were partially empty for a lot of commodities. So a couple of weeks later, when there was another storm coming through that same vicinity, we were able to take this supply chain map, provide it to the emergency managers in the region and say, you know, you might want to start getting ready for a potential disruption of food supplies, even if it's short-lived, and do what you would normally do to make sure that people can get access to food during that time. So it was really helpful that way. We also used it when we got the early warning that there was a convoy of truckers that was driving down to the DC area, and with the intent of driving around the Capitol Beltway and snarling traffic. And so we were able to take the same supply chain map and get it out to our emergency managers again and say, you know, you might want to deploy some additional law enforcement and Department of Transportation resources to those points around the Beltway where we know that there is particularly heavy flow of commodities. And so they did that, and fortunately it turned out that that event was not nearly as bad as we anticipated, but it was an example of how we can use this kind of mapping to begin to understand a little bit more how we can build resilience into the grocery supply chain. So 2 more quick examples, and then I'm going to hand it off to Katie. The next example is with our fuel supply chain. And we basically took the same approach there. We wanted to know where does all the refined petroleum fuel products that we need in our region come from? Gasoline, diesel, Jet A fuel. So we applied the same supply chain mapping approach, and we identified that all of our refined petroleum product comes from the Gulf Coast through 2 pipelines, Colonial Pipeline and the Kinder Morgan Pipeline that run parallel. So we have a sense now of the factor of distance from supply to demand. We know too that once that fuel comes up the pipeline, that it gets offloaded at bulk fuel terminals at various points in the region. And we know then that from that point, fuel distributors come, pick up the fuel and take it in to both commercial and government fueling stations. So we have a sense now of what the system looked like. We've reached out to all the partners in that system, the pipeline operators, the bulk fuel terminal operators, the fuel distributors, to understand how they're thinking about resilience of their operations. And we brought them together in a workshop and a tabletop exercise where we looked at a fuel disruption and said, what might happen here and what would we need to collectively do? And it pointed out a whole lot of improvements that we need to be making in the system, but it was really good to do that. And certainly in terms of early warning, we didn't have a whole lot of warning about the cyber attack, but we did have some warning a couple of weeks ago when Colonial announced that they had shut down line 3 of the pipeline for unplanned maintenance because they had a leak at one of their stations. We saw that and we knew that that was where all the fuel that comes to DC is traveling through. So we got that information out to our fuel customers and our senior leadership in the district, just to make them aware that there may be a potential shortage of fuel and some price spikes that might come up as a result. So this was really useful for that. Last example I'm going to show you is with in the healthcare sector. So again, we took the same approach with that. We went to the health and medical coalitions in our region and we said to them, what are those basic commodities that your hospitals and skilled nursing facilities and dialysis centers and primary care facilities, what are those things that they really need for day-to-day operation? And each one has slightly different needs, but they came back and basically said there's 5 things that really matter to us. It's medical gases, it's blood products, it's linen and laundry, it's medical and surgical equipment, and it's pharmaceuticals. So we talked to those facilities, we understood who their major suppliers were. We went and identified those suppliers and talked to them about how they run their operations and how they think about business continuity, overlaid the same freight network on top of this. And then we got now a pretty good picture of what the healthcare supply chain looks that serves the region. And what this map shows us is that we've got dependencies again on Eastern Pennsylvania, but also up in New Jersey, and also a heavy dependence on some areas around the Richmond area. We brought all these stakeholders together in a workshop where we talked about potential disruption scenarios, and we're planning on doing more of that. In terms of early warning, what we learned was that last January, when that section of I-95 north of Richmond shut down for 24 hours, that's a major transportation route for a lot of medical products that come into our region. And fortunately, there was very little disruption in that because the healthcare community in our region had taken steps to build up their supplies, make sure they had enough surplus going into the winter season. So it was fortunate that didn't happen. But what that told us is that going forward, we need to be paying attention to the weather, both south of DC and certainly up in Philadelphia, New Jersey area, because we have heavy reliance on those parts of the country. So I hope that was of some use to you. Really, I wanted to just give you a sense of the fact that supply chain resilience is really important to the emergency management community. And we recognize that in many ways, we can't do a whole lot to restore flow, but we do know, and we want to know what that system looks like. We want to know who we need to be talking to. And then we need to be using that as a platform to start having ongoing conversations again before something really bad happens, particularly a catastrophic event that might affect a lot of the region. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing. And Katie, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you. And then when Katie's done, we'll be happy to take whatever questions have been posted in chat.
Great, thank you, Mark. Can everybody hear me?
You're good, Katie.
Great, thank you. And I apologize, I'm getting over a head cold, so have my tea here. Been drinking it all week. Okay, so today what I'd like to discuss is, from our perspective, how we increase resilience and we ensure that the goods flow on our end. So we'll talk a little bit about the strategies that we use to keep that food supply chain running. We'll also discuss the lifelines that we're dependent on, and then some of the strategies that I think are beneficial for improving public sector, private sector partnerships and increasing overall supply chain resilience. So let's see. Okay, so we've talked about, Mark has mentioned CNS before. If you're not aware, we are the largest wholesale grocery company in the US. You can see from here, these are the many stores that we service. We also operate retail stores in the form of Grand Union in New York and Piggly Wiggly in the Midwest. So we're a pretty large presence. And I think one of the interesting things is, because we have a national footprint and we deal with a wide range of hazards, we're able to use a lot of the strategies that work in one region and apply it to different regions as well for other potential hazards. So it's really interesting to see what works based on the different regions, how they operate, and also what the different hazards that they face are. But it's really beneficial in terms that we can get those best practices and bring them to other parts of our company when we do see, natural hazards and other types of events. So this is just an example of the customers that we serve. You can see that they are large chains as well as your smaller mom and pop stores as well. So, I think COVID absolutely taught us a lot about how how we can shift and adjust to rapid changes within the food supply chain. And we've actually used a lot of those strategies in other events since then too. So, our selectors, those folks that work in our warehouses, our distribution centers, are at the heart and soul of what we do. And without them, there is no product coming in or going out to the stores that ultimately serve households and consumers in your communities. So, if we think that there's going to be high absenteeism, there are a few things that we can do. We can offer incentives. We can offer hotel our employees closer to the distribution center so that they don't, encounter transportation issues getting on site. We'll adjust those shift start and end times to make it easier for people to come in either before or after the hazardous weather strikes. Because we're a large company, we can also bring in other employees from other regions. So we have a capability to really move our employees around so that those employees who might face impacts to their personal households and their families, they can work on recovering and, getting those things done on the personal end, and then their colleagues will help backfill those positions in those areas that are really, hard struck. And we'll also work with contractors, 3PL, and selectors in the food service industry. They know how warehouses work. They understand how to select food product, to put that onto trucks and to ship it out to stores. So for us, that partnership that we used during COVID was really beneficial in terms of supporting our employees when we needed to add extra headcount. When we do see that there's a lot of demand in the warehouses, we know what the stores want pre and post event. So we can strategically plan about what we bring in and then also push out. We'll also work to optimize the warehouse so that our selectors are maybe picking less of certain things, but they're picking more of a product. So an example that I'll give is they might pick pallets. So instead of moving cases of water, they'll just move a pallet of water out to a store. We can also move our stores to different warehouses if needed, just based on the incident. So let's say that a warehouse is down for an extended period of time. That's a strategy that we could look to use. Okay, we work with our stores to really make sure that they're up and running and that they can accept product before we send our goods out too. So in anticipation of an event, or if a store does lose power, we can drop refrigerated trailers there to make sure that they don't lose some of that important essential refrigerated product that they need for households. And that will be on site. Basically, the employees, they will pull the product out from the store, put it on the trailer to make sure that it maintains the temperatures that are needed. And then as soon as the store gets electricity back up and running, their employees are on site, we will net our goods there. And then also with high consumer demand, what we do, and what's actually pretty interesting, is that we work to ensure that everybody gets their fair share of whatever those high demand products are. So the manufacturers might place limits on wholesalers like us and our counterparts. And we will place limits to stores so that they can order a certain amount, but to ensure that really that item that's in demand is kind of spread throughout our network. Stores are responsible for enacting those limits and setting those at the consumer level. So an example that I'll bring up is, during the formula shortage last year, we saw a lot of stores enact limits of 2 or 4 or maybe even 1. We will also encourage substitutions. So for example, a different size of the product or a different brand, maybe it will be like a private brand, off-label type brand, but we'll try to work to get our customers the same product, but a different type or size. And then we do have what I'll call algorithms in place to make sure that we're moving, let's say, bread and milk and canned goods and not croutons and oregano, because we understand what those high priority items are, what those WIC items are that are essential that the communities need and want. So, when we do see an event that will impact consumer demand and the way that people buy, we will start, several days out, making the adjustments to make sure we're bringing the right product into our warehouses. Okay, so food and water obviously is a very important lifeline. And we really do depend on other lifelines to do the work that we do. I think that there's increasing recognition that food and water is really essential. Obviously in terms of restoration, healthcare facilities, first responders, those types of locations come first, but food and water is very important. So the way that we depend on other lifelines is really interesting. If you've ever walked into a warehouse before, you will see that we are so dependent on our machinery, refrigeration. We use electricity to manage our space, so we know what's actually on site, whether it's in the yard or within the actual physical, 4 walls of the warehouse. We also depend on fuel and electricity to, run our trucks, and also those refrigerated trailers that bring eggs and milk and other perishable products to the stores. Then the stores themselves, they rely on that to have refrigeration, to send their orders to us so that we know what to send them, then also for their point of sale registers. So, I think when you think about generators at the grocery store level, it probably changes region by region. Also, chains versus your smaller mom and pop stores, urban locations where it's harder to have a generator, that's, I think, a challenge in itself. Then also the responsibility of installing and maintaining one, right? So those operators have to determine whether or not it's worth the cost and then the personnel that's required to maintain that piece of equipment once it's installed. As it relates to communications, we depend so much on the internet and those service providers to do the work that we do. So, it's not a manual ticket that we get where we're picking things and we're looking at something manual that's called in over the phone. It's these electronic file transfers that we depend on to know to order. It is stores that basically they know what's on the shelves and they have systems that can automatically determine how much needs to be ordered back to the warehouse. And that's how they inform us what they need. So, we do use the internet for all that scheduling for everything that comes in, figuring out what's going out, then also determining where are our trucks on the road, how many are out, when are they coming back, and so on and so forth. We also use it to manage our upstream communication to vendors so that we can order products from them. Then also to troubleshoot issues with stores. We have portals that our customers can use. And again, that's how they send our orders. Okay, and then also, we, as much as our selectors in the warehouses are the heart and soul of what we do, also, at the end of the day, we are a logistics and transportation agency that is working with very limited assets to send goods out day in and day out. So when we have equipment, that piece of equipment, and it's usually those refrigerated trailers, they're very important to us. And so that those assets are limited, right? We don't have a infinite amount of drivers or an infinite amount of refrigerated trailers. So we have to use them really wisely and really understand, if there is an incident, where should we ship to and where should we hold back from? Does it make sense to maybe go further out where there's no bad weather, or maybe ship a little bit closer to make sure our drivers can get back safely in time for whatever the hazard might be. We'll also monitor things like travel bans, restrictions, and waivers, because that does impact a lot of what we can and can't do. We ship, across multiple states. So oftentimes New England will ship all the way down to New York City or New Jersey, or in Florida, we'll ship all the way to South Carolina. So if drivers encounter any restrictions or issues along that long stretch, then those are hours that are burned that we need to recover somewhere or bring in extra resources to help scale up during an incident. Then also once the drivers get on site, there's also traffic considerations, weather considerations with how they shut down bridges or roads given the potentially high winds, then also delivery ordinances that certain locations might have. Okay, so thinking about how we can better partner together. This is for our government partners, some recommendations that I have based on my experience through a range of hazards that I've helped to respond to. So it's helpful to build a systems level understanding of those dynamics within the supply chain. So as an example, food, there is no food supply chain ESF, right? Food can enter your emergency management agencies in a variety of ways, through logistics, through mass care, or like for ourselves, we report in through the private sector ESF many times. So, and I saw this during the baby formula shortage, where that incident impacted a lot of different agencies and it impacted a lot of different areas. It impacted social services, hospitals and healthcare. It impacted nonprofits because they do help people get that essential commodity. And it also impacted the private sector. It impacted what we could put on the shelves because we were being limited as well, right? So the more you can build kind of that big level understanding of what the dynamics are, what the pushes and pulls are, the easier it will be to understand the landscape that's in your own backyard for the communities that you support. One of our DCs can support hundreds of stores. So again, it's across the jurisdictions. We have a very large footprint and a lot of our counterparts do as well. And that will help emergency management agencies support the areas with unmet demand. If you can support facilitation of and restoration of lifelines to support us, that really does help. So like I mentioned before, we are being increasingly recognized as a critical lifeline. I believe it was late fall or early winter last year, there was a White House memo that came out asking the federal government to look at food supply chain resilience. So it's definitely, we're seeing that from the federal level, trickling down to local municipalities as well. However, I think, the policies and the legislation that allows us to operate during times of disaster, it does vary state by state. So one example that I will give is, stores, they'll face power outages quite often. Distribution centers, they do as well. However, as it relates to legislation, there's currently no one size fits all as it relates to prioritizing stores or distribution centers for utility restoration. And as I mentioned before, without electricity, we can't operate or do the work that we do. So, I think it's really interesting in that, people understand the role of grocery stores in their communities, but we don't necessarily have the tools the way that other important critical infrastructure has to be able to allow us to recover as quickly. So I think the other thing that emergency management agencies are really great at, and I hope to work with some of these partners that are here more with, is that when there's an incident, having information that's multi-jurisdictional across a wide swath is really beneficial to us. I'm a team of 1.5 or 2. A lot of you might have seen my colleague Carmela Hinderocker speak over the past 2 days. And we have to monitor the entire US. And a lot of my counterparts who are in the industry, they're very small shops as well. So the more that we can understand what you're monitoring, what's important to you during an incident, and then also if you can translate that into what the potential impacts are for us, that's really helpful. I am not a scientist. People think that I'm a meteorologist all the time at work, and I'm not. I'm just translating what I see from our weather partners. One really good example I'll give of that recently is, with the California flooding, they were monitoring the river gauges, and they really were able to call out, if this goes above, these are the impacts to major highways. And that was a great way to translate that kind of technical information that I'm trying to figure out what it means into really layman's terms that I can then pass on to some of our teams. Another example is there was a recent chemical fire in Illinois, and that does impact wastewater and water treatment plants. And we heard about that from several of our partners, which was really helpful because we started monitoring it. The EPA actually has a page that I did not know of before this, where they talked about potential impacts to water systems. And they spelled it out clearly, what the market share is, what this plant, what the products that they create and what they're used for and what the impact could be. So for us, it's great that we had a one-stop shop to look at that and to monitor it moving forward. Okay, so what we can offer is we can help you understand the food landscape that's in your own backyard. So like Mark had showed some of the maps that he brought up before, we can tell you where we operate out of, who we service, what does it look like, what do we depend on, what are our restrictions, or what are the things that might choke us up. We're happy to provide situational awareness during incidents. And I think this is something that during novel events, it can be very, very beneficial. I'll give an example. During the baby formula shortage last year, we at one point, just the number of calls that we got from our government partners drastically increased because, with media attention and then also consumers seeing it on the shelves, there was a lot of questions about, so what is your role in this? What are you seeing? What are you hearing? And that was information that, I can go back to my procurement teams, see what we're hearing from the manufacturers, and if it, we can share what we can. So we'll let you know how how our operations are impacted. Then also resources like space, equipment, and goods. We donate when we can to our partners. I know during COVID, we had requests to provide space to a nonprofit that was feeding elderly households. So, when we can help, we do try to help. The food supply chain, the players in it are very competitive, but I would like to say that during disasters, we try to make it work so that we can all collaborate together and also support the nonprofits and the other communities that need support. That being said, it does take, administratively, if goods are needed during an emergency, there's always a question of, do you donate or do you purchase? So any of that pre-work that can be done in advance, I know a lot of jurisdictions nowadays, they're thinking, should we stockpile food and water? What does that look like? And that's something that we can support you in either thinking about or, there are ways of managing that inventory outside of jurisdictions having to do that as well. So, and with that, I'll leave it there. I will close my screen and I'm happy to answer any questions.
That's some great information from both Mark and Katie. There's one question that was in the Q&A so far, and if you got any, please put them in there. We'll get to them. It came from Evan. I think it was really directed to you, Mark. Is that some of the maps you showed, are these maps available to county emergency managers? And if available, what medium, ARC, GIS, dashboards, Esri products?
Sure. Great question. Yeah, we use GIS to develop all those maps. Had multiple data sources to put those together. Our intent, certainly with the emergency managers in the National Capital Region, is to share those maps out. We've done that, at least for the food. The fuel and the healthcare are in final development, but the plan is to share those out with everybody that's affected by that. So now how they use that is going to take some doing, but yes, that's the intent.
Excellent. And then there's another question that was in the chat from Mariana is, in what ways could you help your employees become more resilient? The gaps that you see with employee resilience, they are an essential part of your supply chain. So what are you doing? I know, Katie, you talked a little bit about that in your presentation about, getting them closer to the distribution center so that they're available. Is there anything else that you can provide on that?
Yeah. Hi, Mariana. It's nice to see you. So I think just overall, employee preparedness and doing outreach to our employees post-disaster, as a company, we've done a better job at it over the past few years. One thing that we're able to do after a big disaster is have our HR teams call people individually to make sure that they're okay. And if there are issues, what are those issues that they're facing? Is it flooded pipes? Is it an inability to get to work? Is it issues with fuel, which we've seen before as well? So really collecting those themes from our employees and then figuring out, are there large ways that we can tackle them? Are there one-off services that we can, provide them with? And what is it that they need? When we see that there's electricity, for example, if there's large outages and there is individual assistance being granted, we will do things like set up laptops in our common spaces so that people can register for those benefits and so that they can look for the help that they need at their work site. We've set up showers in our distribution centers when people can't, when they don't have water at home. We've done giveaways for toilet paper actually during COVID, during the early days of COVID. So, we really do try to support our employees because we know that ultimately, if they're impacted, then we cannot operate. So and we all work as one team, right? That's one of our values at the company is we work as one team, and every person matters. So, I think one of the tough things that we've had a challenge doing, and that I think we've evolved and improved with, is during day-to-day, those managers, they're in touch with their employees all the time, right? And for them to transition that responsibility to a different department that takes ownership and they're responsible for understanding, doing the employee wellness checks has really helped us, I think, be more agile, understand if we need to surge or bring in other employees from other regions. And it's really allowed us to understand the impact of a hazard on our workforce more quickly and more comprehensively versus managers who they're living in the impacted area. They might be facing problems of their own as well. They're dealing with other facility issues too, right? So, it comes back to one of the emergency management principles of like, who's your backup, right? Can you create good backups within your system to do some of these important things that you might only need to do once or twice a year, but they're really essential in terms of creating visibility within your organization and supporting your employees. So,
how deep is your bench and understanding your number one resource is your people?
Yep.
Excellent, greatly stated. Mark, you mentioned that the maps are available to the folks locally in the DC metro area that you're responsible for. If you're in an area that's not in DC, how would you recommend that people be able to work with their local emergency managers to get access or to start that collaboration, to start that process to evaluating, the supply chain and the cascading events that some of these disruptors could have that provide the tools that you provided for DC?
Yeah, that's another great question. One of the things that we've been doing is sort of taking this message around the country to different conferences and so forth to talk about why we think emergency managers need to think about supply chain resilience. And I've had several people asked me that same question, which is how do I get started? So, I mean, the short answer is I'm happy to talk to anybody about how we did this, and I've done that with a number of communities, both here and actually in Canada, that are real interested in this as well. Be happy to share kind of how we did this. There are also some folks in FEMA at the national office that are focusing on supply chain resilience, and I could certainly point to those resources as a way of connecting, people with local FEMA regional offices. But I'm happy to do that. I think my contact information is in my slide presentation. So if anybody wants to reach out to me about that, I'm happy to tell you how we did it.
Well, the question came from Everett, who's in Hawaii, so it looks like a road trip in your near future.
Well, if I have to, I will, Everett.
I know it's tough. And Katie, you have a little follow-up on the resiliency, the employee resiliency part?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to add, so I realized that I talked a lot about post-boom, right? But what can you do pre-boom to really improve your workforce? I think it's tough. The guidance that we've mentioned to people, like build a go bag, make sure you have a kit, make sure you're prepared. That's been pretty consistent, right, over the past few years. But I think also, we have increasing economic hardship from employees. Some people, to be honest with you, it can be very tough for people to stockpile goods, over a certain amount of time, and to do those things to adequately prepare themselves the way that we emergency managers advise. So what we've done is we've created a few challenges on our social media network internally to have people just think about how they're being prepared. Are their households prepared? What are tips that you have that you can share with your colleagues? Just easy things like that. It's a win. I'm not saying that everybody will be prepared the way that I am with my family, right? Because I do this for a living. But I think socializing what those concepts are throughout the year, not just when it's, disaster time and it comes, helps to create that, that preparedness culture as well. So we've done a few different things to really partner also with our various departments to make sure that we're aligned on messaging, so that we're all aware of, what the priorities are, what are some risks that we see in terms of our employees. So, do people know what to do if there's a tornado that comes, right? Should we do a public messaging campaign? So I think throughout the year, seasonally, we found ways to introduce it and to incorporate into various forms of communication that will hit employees, whether it's through emails, through our social media streams, or through talking points that the managers get to give to their employees.
Great. Some really good information. What's been really an eye-opener for me is, especially, I spent my entire adult life in emergency management from a utility perspective. And a lot of things that I look at, a lot of folks that I pal around with outside of work have no clue even exists. But even now you're learning, people didn't even know what the word supply chain, really, the importance of it until about a year ago, right? When COVID hit and things started backing up and you couldn't go to the grocery store and get the stuff that you need. But it's not just that. You guys have really, people don't realize that Katie and Camilla there's two people doing this for their company, right? And there's a need emergency management group. There's one or two people that are doing this, this collaboration and doing this pre-planning. But it takes a village, right? It's just who you know, and it's the networking that you do on these calls. And hopefully people will be reaching out to Katie and to Mark and their counterparts wherever in the country that you are, to start those relationships, to understanding what your codependent needs are, to ensure that, when the emergency managers are looking for these commodities, whether it's food, for me, from an electrical standpoint, it would be transformers and wires and connectors, or people. You know who to go to and where to go to, and not during the event. It's before the event. It's just like making sure your people are prepared. So, this has been really informative. Katie, Mark, do you have any closing comments you'd like to make to maybe to reach out to some folks for some help, or to provide some information that you'd like to help us with?
Sure. I would be happy to talk to anybody at any time about, how we did this and how you might be able to do it where you are. There are some really good resources at the FEMA national office that I can point you to as well. I guess that what I would say in closing is that one of the reasons that I wanted to do this presentation with Katie was that I think we've been fortunate to have a really good sort of partnership that I've talked about. I think is really important. And so going back to the days of COVID, when we were trying to understand, why we couldn't get food and what that meant, she was really helpful in helping us understand that. And that's the kind of relationship that I think it's really important for us to build going forward. And there's a lot of desire on both sides to do that. Sometimes it's a little tough to figure out, how we can best do that. But what we've consistently heard is that from the industry is we need good situational awareness about what's going on. As Katie said, we need to understand from your perspective how that might impact us. And then if there are things that you can do to help facilitate the restoration of that flow, whether it be making sure that, we're clearing the routes that may have debris on them, whether it means, waiving hours of service rules to let people back in, whether it means escorts into restricted areas. Those are the kinds of things that we know the government can do. And so we just need to keep talking about that and understanding that better. But really appreciate that partnership.
Thank you, Mark. Katie?
Yeah, I'll add to that. So earlier this week, I was toying with ChatGPT. For those who don't know, it's like AI, right? And I asked it, how do you improve food supply chain resilience? And it gave me a very good list of things you could do to increase, food supply chain and supply chain resilience. But what it actually didn't mention was anything about relationships, right? Some of these face-to-face interactions and these conversations that you have where you can actually understand the nuance of how things work, right? And there's nothing that will replace that. It's picking up the phone, meeting people face-to-face, and understanding who's in your backyard or even the neighboring backyards that impact the supply chains within your community. I'm half of a team at my company, and a lot of companies don't even have people who focus on business continuity or emergency management. It might be somebody who's in facilities. It might be an operations director. So, if you're in the public sector, I would recommend you find that person who will be the champion, who's responsible maybe for that life safety or operations that you can talk to understand more about the work that they do and develop that relationship. I'm always happy to answer questions that people might have, if we operate in your area. But it's not just wholesalers. There are food service providers that support correctional facilities, healthcare facilities. So we do have a lot of counterparts, and the landscape is really vast. So, develop those relationships, understand your supply chains, and thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I really enjoyed the event today. Thank you, Dave.
We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day. I'm sure that you're probably working late today to catch up for what you didn't get done doing this. So we really appreciate it. It's been excellent. I will remind the participants, the attendees, there's a link in the chat for a survey. Again, like I said earlier, feedback is a gift. That's how Laura and Tom and the team make these presentations and reach out and get these experts here to provide this valuable information to help us all grow and understand what it is that we can do to make these summits even more valuable to you.